Good morning, or afternoon, whatever the case may be for you. My name is Sylvain Chamberlain. I took my vows as a Nichiren Buddhist monk amongst the people in 1988. Excuse me. I've been studying Buddhism then for about 27 years. I've studied, I guess, full disclosure, I've studied with Nichiren Shoshu of America, NSA. I then studied with SGI, Soka Gakkai. While I was studying with those groups, however, I also spoke directly to the priest at Myohoji Temple, kept my connections directly through the temple membership as a Hokeiko member. And I also did a lot of research on my own. If you're anything like me, I'm quite a skeptic. And so I need to prove things to myself. I don't just take people's words for things. That also makes me a bit of a tenacious researcher. And I came to a great deal of respect for the tremendous amount of scholarship in the Buddhist teachings and the Buddhist sutras specifically. And also, you end up becoming a bit of a historian, East and West, and you begin to discover a lot of the rewriting, let's say, of history in the West and the East, and how people as populations and groups tend to work and develop ideas over time. So the study of Buddhism has been kind of a study of man and history, and as well as myself, and digging for the truth. I've since long left the Soka Gakkai, the Saiko Ikeda's organization. I'm not here to badmouth anybody. I'm just, again, full disclosure, I want you to know where I've been. I've studied a lot of scholarship, books written both by authors from the United Kingdom, more contemporary books by Mr. Cleary, Jacqueline Stone, Japanese and Chinese names that I cannot pronounce, dug into Nichiren's actual lineage, his disciples, Tendai, the scholarship before Nichiren, and before Tendai, standouts like Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu and others. There is a very important lineage of scholarship throughout Buddhism. Of course, you know, the Theravada Buddhists will tell you that they have their lineage and it's the most pure and don't bother looking elsewhere. Those words really bother me from any sect, and I'm not just picking on Theravada, because the Buddha was very explicit, and this is in any teachings, no matter how esoteric or weird that you look into the Buddhist teachings, unless they've really gone out of their way to not diminish, but well, yes, diminish, but I mean actually just slander the teachings and rewrite it their own way. Everywhere there's a consistent thread from the historical Buddha, who was an actual person, to study broadly, to focus individually and intimately, but to study broadly, because ultimately knowing more, the more you know, the more you come back to center. After 27 years, I can tell you that I've repeated that scenario over and over and over, and yet I'm still doing it. So, first of all, congratulations to you for being curious, for studying. There's one thing in particular I want to focus this talk on, and it's probably going to take several iterations, several videos, part 1, part 2, part 3. I'll try to be concise, but if you've studied Buddhism at all, uh, conciseness, if I can make up that word, uh, is not a strong facility of Buddhism. Although there are very simple truths, like the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, but the moment those are the sentences that you read, and the minute you read them, you go, how? Yeah, well, how? One of the things, and this is what I want to start off this conversation with Buddhism, that if you study if you're a curious mind and you're asking questions and you're digging into what is this Buddhism, how does it work, how did it come to be, and who is this guy Buddha? And you see all these books, and some are called sutras, and some are called the words of, and some are called all kinds of different labels. And if you study across, and please study across more than one sect or group, as I said, I went out of the sects entirely myself. You could argue I started my own Sangha, yes, I have started my own Sangha. And I gave it a label, whatever label means. Nagarjuna was very instrumental in me clarifying very clearly, and that's Nagarjuna, basics about the Buddha's words, the Buddha's teachings. And that's what you end up coming up with is you start seeing slight, I won't say discrepancies, but interpretations seem to float a little bit. For instance, a biggie for me was Nichiren Shoshu, specifically that sect, claims that through Nichiren's Gosho, his writings, that they can evidence that he is actually the original Buddha, beyond the historical Buddha, and that the historical Buddha came to his enlightenment because of the teachings that he, Nichiren, discovered long before Buddha's existence. That is nowhere in the Gosho. That is nowhere does Nichiren say, I am the Buddha. He does talk about the expounding of Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, or Myoho Renge Kyo, more accurately, being the summation and the totality of the Buddha's teachings. That phrase, that sound, that sensation, that rhythm that is encapsulated in Myoho Renge Kyo, conceptually, calligraphy, all of it encapsulates enlightenment itself, and therefore is the vehicle that Buddha swore he would expound from the day of his enlightenment, that would bring all sentient beings, no matter what state of intelligence or life or wealth or whatever, to their inherent enlightenment in this lifetime. This is the radical thought of Nichiren Buddhism to begin with. But then to say that that means that Nichiren was the Buddha beyond the historical Buddha, that is a sect. That is a regional conceptualization. And that annoyed the heck out of me. I wanted pure Buddhism. I want to know, what did Buddha say? If his religion, if his thought, if his philosophy, I don't like to call it a religion, because it's really about retraining our human minds to stop being clouded by all our illusions and wants and attachments and all those veils of misinterpretation of what's really going on in the life of the world, the universe, and cleaning up our perceptions so that we're not constantly manipulated by our egos, our desires, our attachments, which lead us into making mistakes, being human, the human condition. So Buddha doesn't want to annihilate the human condition. He says, no, what you have to understand is your Buddhahood, your enlightened nature, it's right there. It's in you. It's around you. It's everywhere. You just need to kind of wake up, really focus, learn how to look there instead of all those other places. So it's all about training the mind. It sounds real simple. It requires moment by moment effort. And everything else is about tools to help us do that. So there it is. That's the whole thing. Starting to ascribe words like worship and deities and all of those other things. Please understand, all of those are regionally created, personally created mythologies to try to create analogies to go, hey, look, if you learn a game, you got to learn the rules and you got to figure out how this works. And then as you learn the game, you become better because you're training your mind. Well, that's not to say that Buddhism is a game or a video game or whatever. It's just using an example, using an analogy to try to get your mind to think differently, to think anew about the same old stuff. Okay? So, the big question that usually comes up at some point in your practice, and some point in your because you can't practice, you can't chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo endlessly without at some point thinking, what do those words mean, and who wrote them, and who's to say he's right or she's right? And Gongyo, go through the exercise of learning that, a recitation. At some point, not everyone, but most, if you're curious and skeptical like me, you're going to say, okay, what do these words mean? Why am I reciting them? Why are they important? And who wrote them? That's a bit of a conundrum, and that's a darn good question, and it's a question that all of you should be asking because it leads to the root of why study is so important in the practice of Buddhism. In a nutshell, the historical Buddha, when he awakened fully to the nature of life and our human condition, it was the convention, it wasn't just Buddha's idea, it was the convention at the time that the way you taught people, you have to understand now, back in, what we're talking about 3,500 years ago, some 3,500, 4,000, long time ago. You didn't go to school, you didn't get a diploma, there were just certain wealthy, powerful families, powerful groups, wealth, that could afford to even entertain the idea of written language. Or even as you study a written language in any country, the language has very simple daily usage, and then it has much more evolved conceptual usage. Well, Pali and Sanskrit, which Pali is derivative of, ancient languages, were only learned by those in the wealthy class who could afford the scrolls, afford the scholar to come and teach their children and share these conceptual thoughts and so forth. Most of the population, they could communicate certainly with each other, but if you showed them calligraphy, most of them probably wouldn't recognize it, or if they did, in a very simplistic way, or know what it, but they couldn't discuss these concepts. They didn't understand. It was hand to mouth. You didn't have cell phones and so forth. You get it. So the way teachings, especially of things like philosophy, were handled were in a very ritualized form, where I would repeat the same thing to you 3 times. I would repeat what I'm saying in words thrice. 3 times I would tell you the same thing with slight variations. And then I might even, at the end of my teaching, put all of it again, perhaps threefold, into a very rhythmic kind of prose. Do you see where we're going here? When you want to learn something, even today, when you go to school and you learn math, you learn what? Your times tables, your goes intos, right? You have your mechanisms of repetition and testing. And so the teaching mode back then was not written, because there were all different facets of language, especially in India. Just language. There's 127 languages today that are all official languages of India. Imagine if there were 127 different versions of English spoken in the United States. So, the tradition to teach was oral, but it was very methodical oral. I mean, you learned this thing and you repeated it and you repeated it, and you were asked to repeat it back. Recitation. You recited back the lesson you learned. And you asked a question 3 times 3 different ways. Why? Because that involves training the mind to not just see. If you're forced to ask or do something 3 different ways, you really have to start breaking down what it is you're asking, and there's a certain amount of clarity that comes from that. Yes? So this is how the teachings were transmitted, orally. And so only those who were disciples, who were students dedicated to this back and forth of recitation, really knew the lesson, the teaching. The people on the periphery, oh, those people, but they couldn't recite it. It was only after the Buddha's death that these people who were disciples and had learned this stuff and repeated it every day, morning and evening, over and over and over, thought, oh, we better write this down. So this is where the first scripture was written for Buddhism. It was not written by Buddha. It was all taught orally. But that doesn't make it any less valid. Now I'm going to continue the rest on the next video because that's over 17 minutes. But I think that's a good start. I hope I got your interest. And we'll go on from that, and I'll try to share with you as much knowledge as I've gained and I'm able to transmit, and I may be repetitive. That's just my training. Anyway, see you next time. Thank you for listening.